what Ariel Sharon had to do in Central America. Why the Minister of Defense of Israel will go to Central America? Why? Central America is so far from Israel. But why Ariel Sharon went to Central America?
Israel receives more U.S. military aid than any other nation. Yet Israel itself has a thriving arms industry. Its military exports have at least doubled every 2 years since 1969. Israel is now the world's 7th largest arms merchant and is a major arms supplier to Central America, specifically to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. I'm Jane Hunter. Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon's trip to Honduras last December and subsequent reports of secret deals inspired this program. There were many answers to the most basic questions about the quantity, quality, and meaning of Israel's presence in Central America. Israel's decision following the 1967 war to develop a domestic arms industry and reduce its dependence on arms from abroad led to a search for export markets. With increasing frequency, customers were found among the world's most notorious right-wing governments. Arnaldo Ramos, diplomatic representative of El Salvador's Democratic Revolutionary Front.
After the Carter human rights policy, which forced military right wings to look for arms elsewhere from the United States, Israel became one of the major suppliers, especially to Nicaragua's Somoza, to the Guatemalan regime up to today especially, and also to the Salvadoran regime after the civil war began openly in 1979. According to the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, Israel has been supplying 4/5 of the Salvadoran military's arms. They include, this is after the Civil War began, they include 25 Arava short takeoff and landing tactical transport aircraft, 18 refurbished Dassault Uragan fighter bombers, 6 overhauled aerospatial Fuga Magister trainers, and large quantities of Uzis of machine guns and Galil assault rifles. The PLO in ambassador to Nicaragua reported that about 100 Israeli military specialists were training the Salvadoran Army and Air Force in counterinsurgency and weapon maintenance at a base 20 miles from San Salvador in a close military area. And to understand the role of Israel vis-a-vis El Salvador, you have to also find out what is going on in Honduras, which more and more is the counterinsurgency regional base aimed at Nicaragua against the Sandinista regime and aimed at us in El Salvador.
In 1981, the Financial Times of London estimated that 300,000, roughly 1/4 of Israel's labor force, were employed in defense-related jobs. This information is included in an article about the intention of newly appointed Defense Minister Sharon to take control of the defense industry, boosting both exports and political benefits for Israel. Arnon Hadar, Israeli-born economist and editor of Solidarity publications, sees additional consequences.
Israel in 1977 had military exports of, in the neighborhood, a little bit above $400 million. In 1980, it was $1.4 billion. Today, probably it's in the neighborhood of $1.8 billion. It fluctuates between 25 and 40% of all Israeli exports. It becomes a major industry in Israel, especially in metallurgy and electronics. And then it may imply something about the economic viability of Israel. Because if this process continues, then one day Israel would not be able to do without military production. And that is very, very important internally. I mean, it determines the economic path that Israel may take, or it determines also the relative power of the various sectors in Israel. I mean, the army and ex-generals and ex-colonels would slowly take hold also of the economic aspect of Israel, not only the military aspect.
Marc Allen, for 12 years the foreign editor of People's World newspaper, had a further comment on Israel's aspirations.
As Sharon has stated on many occasions, to show that in fact Israel is not merely a strong military country within the Middle East, but in fact possesses the potential to be a superpower, which is, I think, is overstated, but it is definitely Sharon's view, and this is one way of proving it.
Supporters of Israel's arms trade argue that willingness to sell the world's most recently battle-tested weapons to some of the world's most right-wing regimes might help to allay anti-Semitism. A recent Miami Herald article, however, suggested that future loss of markets is inevitable as Israel's right-wing clients give way, through revolutions or elections, to more popular governments that will resent Israel's aid to their opponents. Arnon Hadar.
The contradiction between Israel's role as a country which has economic interests and a country the major element of which is Jews, and the assumption that Israel is, among other things, supposed to protect Jews in the world in general. These contradictions would develop and has been developing in many different directions, and one of them, which will develop in the future, will be in Latin America, where as more and more liberation movements would win, then because of Israel's past policy of supplying arms always to the military regimes, then they would run into open conflicts with these regimes, like with the Sandinista, which would later, of course, be interpreted as pro-PLO regimes rather than regimes that naturally react to Israeli supplies of arms to the previous military regimes as the cause. I think that it is simply shows a contradiction of Israel's foreign and internal policy in general, the common denominator of all the regimes that it supplies arms to, from the Shah to Argentina, as we say, South Africa, Uganda, Guatemala, etc. It supplies arms to regimes that have very strong inclination to become also anti-Semitic.
Questions about the precise relationship of U.S. and Israeli roles in Central America breed more questions. It's believed that a 1981 secret agreement between Israel and the United States included the opportunity for Israel to supply arms on behalf of the United States. And it's known that when the U.S. Congress forced a halt to El Salvador's military aid in 1981, Israel complied with a Reagan administration request and sent El Salvador $21 million in aid. Israeli cabinet minister Yaakov Meridor had this message for the United States. Do not compete against us in the Caribbean or in any other country where you can't operate in the open. Give us the ammunition and military hardware. Let Israel act as your agent. On December 17th, Leslie Gelb in the New York Times quoted a high State Department official with this comment on Washington's attitude toward Israel's activities in Central America. We've indicated we're not unhappy they're helping out, but I wouldn't say we and the Israelis have figured out together what to do. There might be some truth to that. According to various reports, the visit of Sharon to Honduras came as a surprise to the State Department. On December 19th, the New York Times reported that Sharon had appealed to the Reagan administration to help finance Central American purchases of Israeli arms. The deal was to allow Guatemala and Honduras to spend part of their American military aid, called foreign military sales credits, on Israeli weapons. Francisco Garrett Higuera, for 19 years an officer in the Salvadoran Army, served as Undersecretary of the Interior in the 1979 junta. He later fled for his life.
Sharon's visit to Central America, you see, would just but confirm our fears, you see, in the sense that the present Israeli administration is committed to provide support to this dictatorial regime in El Salvador, okay, and to the proxy regime in Honduras. Okay. If U.S. military aid is cut off in El Salvador, be sure that the Israelis have already taking over, right, very, very smoothly. Okay. Be sure that this visit of Sharon to Central America is geared to that. What Ariel Sharon had to do in Central America? See, okay. What is Israel? If Israel has those supposed to be big and terrible, or whatever you want to call them, problems in with its neighbors, okay. Why the Minister of Defense, okay, of Israel, okay, will go to Central America? Why? Central America is so far from Israel, okay. Okay, it would make sense to have Ariel Sharon, going to Egypt, to hold talks with the Egyptian president. Okay, but why Ariel Sharon went to Central America? Of course, you would deduce. You could say that he went just to reassure those regimes that if the USA military aid fades out, okay, Israel will take over.
Marc VanderHoud, a member of the National Lawyers Guild and chair of the Guild's Committee on Refugees, visited Guatemala in 1979. At that time, the Carter administration denied U.S. arms to Guatemala.
And you could walk around and see Israeli-made machine guns all over the place that the Army was carrying at that point in time. And a lot of the trade union people that we met with, we were invited down by the trade union sectors to specifically investigate repression against the trade union movement. Talked to us about how Israel had stepped in and all the arms were coming now into Guatemala from Israel. And they could ignore really United States warnings because Israel was filling that gap, and it seemed to us, though we had no evidence at that point in time, that was fine with the United States also. The United States is still seen as the primary force intervening in Central America. There's no doubt about that. It's Yankee imperialism throughout is what is being talked about. People do recognize also the role that Israel is playing, and people do realize the United States wants to, on the one hand, keep its hands somewhat clean and have Israel supply a lot of the arms. It's a dual effort. In my opinion, it's definitely a coordinated effort.
Arnaldo Ramos of the FDR sees a more direct connection.
They have become a very important instrument of United States foreign policy goals, both in South Africa and in Latin America. We would put the role within that global structure. And of course, the United States always claims that they cannot, detect the armed flows of Israel to these countries, or that they cannot prevent them, which is totally hypocritical, especially in the light that the United States seems to be very, very effective at detecting armed flows from socialist countries, even when they do not exist. Only one word could stop Israel from supplying those weapons to the right-wing dictatorships. And people oftentimes forget in this country that Israel supported Somoza in Nicaragua to the very, very last moment of his downfall. And it was Israeli weaponry and training the one that allowed Somoza to carry on such a huge destruction of the economic infrastructure of the country. And we actually believe that was done on purpose, and the United States knew it, that by destroying the economic infrastructure of Nicaragua, it was going to make it extremely difficult for the new government, the Sandinista government, to recover. And it would make it a lot easier for the United States to conduct a policy of economic destabilization as they're doing today. And so you see how beautifully Israel plays alongside the interests of the United States. Also, you have to conclude that the huge amounts of economic military aid that the United States sends to Israel is precisely so that Israel can play this role. It's all intimately connected, linked, and the American people are really paying for the Israelis to play that global role. As the United States gets more and more involved in Central America, and as international public opinion in this country begin to put more and more pressure, the role of Israel will increase inevitably. And if the present policies, for example, of this administration continue in Central America, it's certainly going to become an international conflict that will see Israel directly involved.
Arnon Hadar does not see Israel's role in any one country as being pivotal, but he believes that with the growing trend toward regionalization, that could change.
As an overall evaluation, I don't think that it is very significant. I don't think that the Israeli presence in Central America had a significant effect on the Salvadoran conflict. I do not think so. I think that in the longer run, in the dynamics of Central America, if it is true that the regional aspect of the conflict in Central America is going to be more and more pervasive, then by strengthening the Guatemalan armed forces, you strengthen the militaries in the area vis-a-vis the opposition. And in that sense, Israel may play a crucial role, because if you strengthen the military in Honduras, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, and if the war becomes regionalized, that is to say the conflict in El Salvador is affected and affect emerging or existing conflicts in other countries, then it slowly becomes a war between the armies on the one hand and, say, at least the oppositions on the other hand.
As Israeli weapons have become more and more powerful and sophisticated messengers of death, they've been employed in more and more places where death is planned. Moral and political questions about who is on the receiving end of these armaments tend not to get asked. If you deal with enemies of humanity, you become one. Then whoever doesn't need your guns will not buy your flowers either. This by Amos Kennan, Israeli novelist and columnist in The Nation, December 4th. Marc, VanderHoud.
When the people in those movements talk about Israel, it's a completely different feeling from the population of the United States, which still has this image of Israel as the blessing for the Middle East, a progressive country, maybe with some few aberrations here and there, but basically a model to be looked at. It's not true at all in the Third World or in Central America, which I'm most familiar with, where Israel is viewed, like South Africa, as one of the most brutally repressive regimes in the world, and one of the most reactionary, and one that will support someone like Somoza and will sell arms to the Guatemalan dictatorships and will sell arms to whoever they can.
Jane Rassmussen, who visited Honduras in November of last year with a National Lawyers Guild fact-finding team, relates a poignant detail of her conversations with Salvadoran refugees in the Mesa Grande camp.
And these people are just sitting ducks. I mean, they said, here we are. We're surrounded by barbed wires. There's soldiers all around us. All we've got are our machetes. What are we going to do? They were very aware of the massacres that had happened in the Palestinian camps in Beirut, and definitely saw the analogy between the situation of the Palestinian camps in Beirut and the vulnerability that they're experiencing now in Honduras.
While Israel's arms sales have gone all but unnoticed, they have been documented. It's not so easy to document the operations of Israeli intelligence forces in Central America. Arnaldo Ramos, FDR diplomatic representative.
They are playing a bigger and bigger role, inevitably. At the level of intelligence, of course, their major role in San Salvador, in the cities, is in the detection of, monitoring and detection of suspected people. For example, supplying very sophisticated technology that detects the number of phone calls made. If there are too many phone calls, too much electricity used in the telephone, that telephone becomes right away suspect of being used by the revolutionaries. They use very sophisticated electronic equipment to monitor the presence of people on the streets. For example, they block periodically several downtown areas, and they take the IDs of people just to check who are they. If they find that the person happens to be in downtown in an area where he's not supposed to, too often during the week, that right away makes him a suspect. They use a computer. Since the years of Vietnam, the United States was legally forbidden to train police forces from around the world. All of those roles that, with this limitation, more of those roles are played by Israel.
Lou Wolf, editor of Covert Action Information Bulletin, has heard about a similar computer system installed by Israel in Guatemala City.
From my understanding of what the program is in Guatemala, and as I say, it still needs to be researched further, it's in the range of, or in the context of gathering raw intelligence about and collating all the raw intelligence available about all kinds of people across the political spectrum in Guatemala, but generally directed at people to the left of center, to gather every kind of intelligence imaginable about their lifestyle, about their the people that they're in touch with, all the things that make up a person's daily life. And this information is placed in a computerized data bank, which is then used to build dossiers on those individuals. And it's quite frightening, really, how this could be used.
Former Colonel Garrett saw Israeli advisors in El Salvador during the 70s.
I can talk about what I knew about Israeli participation before Romero was deposed. I knew very well, because of the fact that I was in the military, and I had access to some things anyway. And I knew that there were some Israeli advisors, that were helping Romero's secret police in El Salvador, called Ancesal. They were very active at the time, and I never heard that those advisors left El Salvador. Okay. And when you notice that you had Ariel Sharon visiting Honduras, especially after the massacres in Chavachatila, in Lebanon, right? What can you expect about the Israeli intelligence presence in El Salvador? And keep in mind that they are now more active because they knew that the PLO was supporting to the popular movement in El Salvador. So I bet that Ariel Sharon will increase the punishment, of the popular movement in El Salvador through his advisors, because of the fact, that the PLO was supporting the popular movement in El Salvador, and of course that the popular movement in El Salvador was providing moral support to the PLO.
Garrett later told me that Roberto Dubuisson, presently Speaker of the National Assembly, was a minor officer in Romero's secret police Ancesal. This connection becomes significant when considering the recent rebellion of Salvadoran General Ochoa, a Dubuisson ally. The Christian Science Monitor of December 13th says that although Ochoa is highly praised by his U.S. trainers, he takes a rather dim view of them when compared to the Israelis. The article further states that Ochoa thinks it totally inappropriate to train Salvadoran troops in the U.S. Don't forget, they lost the war in Vietnam, he says. Ochoa credits his training in Israel and by Israeli advisors in El Salvador in the mid-70s for his personal development. Lou Wolf concludes.
So it's not unlikely that Dubuisson and some of his colleagues, one of whom apparently is Ochoa, have ties to Israel and particularly to Mossad. The time that Ochoa was trying to bring General Garcia down, the CIA was actively interested in that particular enterprise. And of course, now we understand why, because Ochoa, his allegiance was not as much as they had thought to the United States.
The U.S. movement against intervention in Central America is growing. Who will protest in Israel? Benjamin Beit Halami, an Israeli professor and editor writing in the New York Times, states, there is virtually no Israeli opposition to this global adventurism. There is no human rights lobby. There are no angry editorials or demonstrations. The Peace Now movement would not dream of protesting Israeli involvement in Guatemala. As far as the Israeli public is concerned, this is a non-issue. Indeed, many Israelis feel that their support for United States interests around the world should earn them special consideration from Washington and the American public. Igal Ahrens, an Israeli citizen and presently a graduate student in the United States, told me that recently a representative of the FDR went to Israel. He was unsuccessful in persuading Israeli liberals or leftists to give any attention to this issue. Ahrens is not optimistic.
I mean, frankly, I find it quite difficult to believe this has come up as a serious issue with a lot of action on it in Israel right now. I mean, up to now, it seemed to me that the peace movement here, the anti-interventionist movement, hasn't really dealt with the question of Israel and its support of Latin American dictatorships at all. As far as Israel goes, the peace movement such that exists there deals with what's they find much more pressing and probably good justification, which is the question of the war between Israel and the Palestinians and the other Arab countries around them. And they very, very rarely even mentioned Israeli support for fascist regimes in Central America.
Marc Allen of People's World hopes there will be a change.
Once the Israeli people have been able to break out of the shackles of thinking that my government right or wrong, then I think that the quest for democracy and the progressive vision that was supposed to be behind the creation of the State of Israel itself will come into being and play a role internally in Israeli politics. The forces who've been struggling for peace and justice in the Middle East, the forces struggling for peace and justice in El Salvador, have a common linkage. Not merely in the notions of justice and the notions of peace and the notions of ridding oneself of oppression, but in the commonality of the enemies and the interlocking of the various forces that are now at work against the oppression of all those peoples throughout the Arab world, throughout the African world, and throughout the world in Latin America.
This program was written and produced by Jane Hunter and